happy and I'm honored actually to be able to introduce our speakers on this very important topic, and I'm really happy that I see such a full room on a internationally often neglected, very serious crisis. So I'm happy to introduce the speakers briefly, and then we'll leave it up to them, and then we'll open it up for questions. As the students who take this as this seminar as a course know, I will start with some questions from the students and then open it up to the larger audience. So Alissa Trotz work is situated within a traditional feminist political economy and a Caribbean feminist tradition in particular that takes an intersectional approach to social reproduction as a starting point and node of interrogation to think through histories and processes of dispossession and their contemporary manifestations. She is an affiliate faculty at the Nita Barrow Institute of Gender and Development Studies, University of the West Indies, Cave Hill, Barbados, and a distinguished scholar at the PJ Patterson Center for Africa of the University of the West Indies in Jamaica. She's currently a member of the O'Neill Lance Commission on Racism, Structural Discrimination, and Global Health, and she's also here at the University of Toronto. Brian Concannon at online works as the executive director of the Institute for Justice and Democracy in Haiti, the US-based NGO that creates pathways to justice and accountability for human rights violations in Haiti. The organization works closely with its sister organization, the Bureau des Avocats Internationaux, as well as with Haitian grassroots groups and Haitian American communities in the US, to raise awareness of and obtain support for the fight for justice in Haiti. While the BAI and other groups work inside Haiti to reform the political systems, IJDH brings the fight to the international arena, such as the United Nations, the United States, where it's more than ever important to fight for this, and other powerful countries where policy decisions can have a dramatic impact on success or failure of the struggle for democracy and justice. Last but not least, Beatrice Lindstrom is a senior clinical instructor and lecturer of law at the International Human Rights Clinic at Harvard Law School. Her work focuses on access to remedies for human rights violations, aid accountability, and Haiti, where she has spent numerous occasions or numerous months. Prior to joining Harvard, Beatrice was legal director at the Institute for Justice and Democracy in Haiti. For nearly a decade, she led advocacy and litigation to hold UN accountable for causing the devastating cholera epidemic in Haiti that will be the subject of this presentation, including as lead counsel in George versus United Nations class action lawsuit, which we'll discuss, so I won't say more about that. She is a recent graduate award from NYU Law School. She received the recent graduate award from the NYU Law Alumni Association and the Zani Haiti Award from the Haiti Solidarity Network. So we are very well placed to hear from our speakers.
Thank you very much, Trudeau. Thank you so much for coming. And I know there's students from Caribbean Studies here who's visiting law. Some of you may end up in this faculty. I heard y'all frightened to leave early because you have other classes, but if you have to go, we won't take it personally. Just get up at that point. I'm just going to offer a little context and then turn it over to Beatrice and Brian, who are really going to lead the presentation today and also predominantly take your questions. So just to offer a little context, I'm one of 20 members of the O'Neill Lancet Commission on Racism, Structural Discrimination, and Global Health that was launched at the end of 2022. It's a 3-year commission that has been that is co-chaired by Dr. Tlaleng Mofokeng, who is the United Nations Special Rapporteur on the Right to Health, based in Johannesburg, South Africa, and Dr. Ngozi Erondu, who is based in Washington and is a senior scholar at the O'Neill Institute for National and Global Health Law at Georgetown University, and also technical director at the Global Institute for Disease Elimination. And the mandate of the commission is to use racism as a lens to investigate systemic discrimination and inequity in health globally. And racism in the commission report is defined by one of the commissioners, Dr. Kamara Jones, as, quote, a system of structuring opportunity and assigning value, structuring opportunity, assigning value based on the social interpretation of how one looks, what we call race, and unfairly disadvantages some individuals and communities, unfairly advantages other individuals and communities, and saps the strength of human society through the depletion or waste of human resources. So the intention of the commission is to investigate systemic discrimination, but also to identify some best practices and actionable anti-racist strategies. And many of your questions were asking these kinds of things, which I'm really interested in hearing about as well, because our report we haven't yet completed that third part. So I'm really looking forward to hearing from Beatrice and Brian in terms of their suggestions and conversation with you, with a view to scaling some of these strategies. We are compiling a report. The report is actually being compiled right now. The intention is going to be to publish the report in the Lancet with some of these sub-reports on the Lancet site, as well as disseminate the findings widely to the public. The Commission has 5 working groups along thematic areas: health and care systems, global governance and finance, legal and state violence, data, tech, research, development, and ours, which is violence, which is crisis and emergency. So the Haiti case study comes under the Crisis and Emergency Working Group. And the report was actually prepared by Kevin Edmonds, who is a professor in the Caribbean Studies program in New College and has brought several of you here. So Kevin, myself, Brian Concannon, Beatrice Lindstrom, Sasha Filippova, who is online, and Kristina Freed. And I'm really happy that we have this opportunity I'm really happy that the Lancet actually accepted our suggestion that Haiti become one of the case studies. This is the deadliest cholera epidemic in modern times. And what Brian and Beatrice are going to talk to you today about is the first class action lawsuit ever brought against the United Nations. It's a pity that Mario Joseph from Haiti can't join us, but I'm really delighted. This is the first time I'm meeting Beatrice in person, so I'm really excited that you have an opportunity to hear from them. And I noticed that Sandra Weisner, who is the director of the IHRP here and on leave, is also online. And Sandra was actually a lawyer with the IJDH, so there's some familiar faces around here. Who is Harmahit? Harmahit here? Harmahit asked a wonderful question about whether the UN occupation of Haiti might be understood, and the word occupation is really crucial, so they'll speak to that, as imperialism and as perpetuating white supremacist beliefs. All I'll say is that the report draws on geographer Ruth Wilson Gilmore's definition of racism as, quote, the state-sanctioned and or extra-legal production and exploitation of group-differentiated vulnerability to premature death. And it uses that as an entry point to examine the 2010 cholera epidemic, one of the largest in modern history, which Haitian scholar Jemima Pierre has described as, quote, an extension of a totality of violence, material, political, and ecological, enacted by the UN peacekeeping mission. I'm going to actually stop here. We can get back to what the report tries to do in the Q&A. And I want to give as much time as possible to Beatrice and Brian to share their work with you and with all of us this afternoon. So thank you.
Thank you, Alissa. And I think we're actually going to start with Brian, so I'll turn it over to Brian.
Okay. Well, thank you. Thanks for the introduction, and thanks to everybody for joining this discussion and for including me. And I really look forward to the questions and to having kind of an ongoing discussion about how we can respond to racist distortions of international law and public health with respect to Haiti and with respect to so many other places. I'm joining you today from a little bit south of Boston in what we are beginning to hopefully call Canada's 11th province. And as mentioned, I'm the executive director of the Institute for Justice and Democracy in Haiti, and I'm going to claim as former colleagues, in addition to Sandra and Professor Edmonds, who did some key collaborations with us back during some of the things that we're going to discuss. The primary fact of Haiti that has influenced all of Haiti's history, and especially the international community's response to Haiti, is that Haiti became a nation through a revolution by enslaved people in an Atlantic world dominated by countries that built their power on the Atlantic slave trade. That was a determining factor in Haiti at the beginning, and it is still a determining factor in 2025. When Haiti became free, it was broadly acknowledged that Haiti had the potential to be an inspiration for liberation and a model of how especially Black people and especially enslaved peoples could be free. That obviously undermined the ideology underlying the enslavement, but it also posed a direct existential threat to the economic world order. The U.S. President Thomas Jefferson, who was a slave owner, he saw Haiti's potential for inspiring liberation as a contagion. I mean, he actually described it in public health terms, and one that needed to be contained. The other powers of the Atlantic world, especially the United Kingdom and France, they very much agreed, and the U.S., France, and the U.K. worked very hard in 1804, but also much later, to prevent Haiti from being an inspiration for other people to demand their own liberation. They refused to recognize Haiti. They refused to trade with Haiti on fair terms. France used the assistance of the collaboration of other countries, but also its own warships, to extract what's called the independence debt, which was a payment that Haiti was forced to make to compensate France's slave owners for their lost property, including their what they called their the lost human property. Haiti was not able to pay off that debt until the 20th century. And in the process, the combination of the debt and other interference in Haiti prevented Haiti from ever developing into a stable, prosperous country. That development was hindered by repeated military interventions, including the U.S. Marine occupation in Haiti from 1915 to 1934, which was the longest U.S. Marine occupation. It involved economic coercion, political coercion, coups d'états, a whole range of efforts to really snuff out Haiti's example at any time that it appeared it might be able to powerfully inspire other liberation struggles. The Haitians never stopped trying to fulfill their historic role. They helped Simon Bolivar twice when he was preparing his liberation struggles in South America. They supported the Greek Revolution. They supported revolutions all over the world to the extent that they could with their limited resources. And that kind of fight between Haiti trying to serve as inspiration and the powerful countries trying to prevent that went right up into the 21st century. So starting in 2000, the very beginning of the century, a progressive movement obtained power in Haiti with a mandate for progressive change. It was headed by President Jean-Bertrand Aristide, and under the Aristide administration, Haiti did a lot to advance a progressive agenda. It doubled the amount of schools, of secondary schools. It doubled the minimum wage. It increased the public health infrastructure to an extent that when the UN fund for malaria, TB, and AIDS was announced, Haiti was among four countries that got the initial grants in the first round of funding. And these democracy was wildly popular in Haiti. There was huge approval ratings for the government's policies. And President Aristide also directly challenged the world order. He gave speeches explaining at the UN General Assembly, he gave speeches talking about how countries like Haiti were poor, in part because countries like the United States were wealthy. He also prepared a legal claim for to demand the restitution of the independence debt, which he had calculated at the time of $21 billion. And the preparation of the legal claim was combined with a public education campaign where Haitians were taught about both the legal issues, but also taught about how the independence debt had hobbled Haiti's development and had prevented them from getting the things that they knew they were missing, such as health care for their kids, education, adequately paid jobs. And as part of the campaign, the government really articulated how many hospitals it was going to build, where it was going to build schools, and how it was going to build a prosperous life for most Haitians. That was one provocation too much. The international community, again led by the U.S., France, and the U.K., they imposed a development assistance embargo, which undermined all the public health advances. It stopped clean water projects. It prevented the government from paying public officials. It closed down schools, to punish the government for advancing the mandate it was elected to do. When the development assistance embargo did not work, the UN, the international community stepped up the pressure, and part of that was actually planned in Canada. In 2003, there was a conference called at Meech Lake, and it was called the Ottawa Initiative on Haiti, where the international community assembled to decide Haiti's future without inviting any Haitian government officials. And the decision that was made was that you needed regime change. And so Canada, joining the US, France, and the UK, started working on regime change for Haiti. They in addition to the development assistance embargo, they supported political organizations that were doing provocative and violent demonstrations. The U.S., at least, I don't think I've seen a Canadian connection, but the U.S. supported an insurgency that was training across the border of the Dominican Republic. And in 2004, that insurgency took over a big chunk of Haiti, but was not able to take over Port-au-Prince. When that became clear, the U.S. literally forced President Aristide onto a plane sent from Guantanamo Bay base in Cuba, filing a false flight plan, and forced President Aristide to exile in the Central African Republic. Now, that was in February 29th of 2004. Haiti has never come close to reaching the level of development, of democratic development, that was lost on that day. And to replace Aristide, the international community did two things. One, they flew in a new prime minister who had been living in Boca Raton, Florida, for most of the previous 20 years, to make him prime minister. And they also, before Aristide's plane had even landed, the Security Council had met to authorize a multinational force, including Canada, including the US, to take over Haiti. And this is particularly notable because in the weeks leading up to the kidnapping of Haiti's president, CARICOM had petitioned the UN to help Haiti maintain its democracy. Now, CARICOM, Haiti's a member of CARICOM. It's the Caribbean community, and it's obviously made up of countries, of majority Black countries. And when CARICOM asked the UN to help, the UN did not even respond. But when the US convened a meeting while the president's plane was still in the air, the Security Council met very quickly and authorized a multinational force that was later transformed into a Chapter 7 mission, peacekeeping mission called MINUSTA. Now, even there was an original sin even to the forming of the Chapter 7 mission, because under Chapter 7, you need to have a breach of a threat to international peace. And Brazil, the country that eventually led the mission, objected, saying there is no basis. This is an internal dispute. There is no international threat to international peace. The U.S. said, take it or leave it. If you want to lead this mission, you're going to have to go along with it. Brazil took it, and so you had a mission that was based on an improper justification, and its purpose really was not to maintain the peace, but primary purpose was to prevent an outbreak of democracy and prevent Haiti from returning to the path where it could serve as an inspiration for other Black liberation struggles. And in fact, the the MINUSTA, although it did do some traditional peacekeeping activities, it did quite a bit to fulfill its mandate to prevent democracy from returning. MINUSTA would provide backup to Haitian police units and paramilitary groups when they went into neighborhoods that were hotbed of pro-democracy organizing. And literally, the MINUSTA troops would secure the perimeter while the Haitian police and paramilitaries went in and slaughtered dissidents. The MINUSTA directly and illegally arrested political dissidents, including one of our clients, a guy named Father Gerard Jean Just, who was an activist Catholic priest, and he was arrested on completely trumped up charges and spent 7 months in prison. I'm gonna pass the baton on to Bia. I'm afraid if I might have gotten a little too much in the weeds there, but go for it, Bia.
So thank you, Brian. So now fast forward to 2010. January of 2010, Haiti suffers a severe earthquake that largely flattens the capital, kills about 300,000 people. And it was in the aftermath of the earthquake that I personally went to Haiti shortly after graduating from law school. In October of 2010, we started hearing panicked news reports coming in over the radio that people were collapsing at the doorsteps of hospitals with profuse vomiting and diarrhea. These were telltale signs of cholera. But it was quite suspicious because Haiti had never experienced a cholera epidemic before in recorded history. The outbreak spread extremely quickly. So I think we first started hearing rumors about this new outbreak on around October 18th. By October 21st, 2010, the Haitian Ministry of Health had confirmed that there was indeed an outbreak of cholera for the first time in recorded history. And in that first week, I think there was 135 suspected deaths from the epidemic. And by the end of the first month of the outbreak, 2,000 people had died. And so the outbreak spread incredibly quickly. We went out to the base, and this is a photo that we took from the base, and you kind of see in the background there faintly, it says the UN. And so this was the MINUSTA base that was home to Nepalese peacekeepers. And you can see the tributary that's flowing alongside the perimeter of the base. And when we were there, I think about a week into the outbreak, my colleague Mario Joseph, who's the head of the BAI, approached these women and said, you know, haven't you heard that the water might be contaminated? And the response we got was, well, we have heard, of course, but what choice do we have, given that this is the sole access to water that we have? And this is a tributary that flows into the Artibonite River in Haiti, which is Haiti's main water source. It supplies water for tens of thousands of people who rely on it for washing, irrigation, drinking, bathing, and so on. And almost as quickly as the cholera itself started spreading around the countryside, we also heard, so move Brian over a little bit here so you can read this. We started hearing rumors that the base was the source of the cholera outbreak. And so there are a few journalists that went to the base to try to investigate about a week into the outbreak, and this is the scene that they came upon when they arrived. Now, there quickly started to emerge evidence pointing to MINUSTA as the source of the outbreak. And so some examples of this was that these were photos from the waste pipes that took gray water waste from the base and essentially disposed of it directly into the tributary. For black water waste, which is also known as waste coming from toilets, MINUSTA's system of disposing of the waste was they contracted with a private contractor who came and pumped up the waste from septic tanks and then drove it across the street and jumped it in open air pits that have been dug directly into the ground. In a village where people's homes were surrounding the open air pits, there was no protection for the local community. And as people began speaking with the community living in the vicinity, it became clear that the community had in fact been voicing complaints about MINUSTA sanitation practices for weeks prior to the outbreak. Because every time it rained, as it often does, especially during the rainy season in Haiti, the pits would overflow, and sometimes they would overflow in the direction of the tributary, and other times they would overflow in the direction of people's homes. Turn it over to you, Brian.
So the evidence of MINUSTA being responsible for the outbreak, it started. Haitians were very quick to point the finger at MINUSTA, and a lot of it was just the geography of the epidemic. The people were downstream from a place where they knew there had been leaking sewage. It kept building until about a year later you had fairly conclusive genetic proof of that, but. And although I initially thought that the Haitians had a point based on the geography, I wasn't convinced. But what really convinced me was just a few days after the outbreak, maybe a week or so, when the UN said, "Oh, we've tested everybody at the base, and it's impossible that the UN is responsible." Now, what was really impossible was that the UN had adequately done that testing and could rule out their responsibility with the certainty that they were communicating. That showed to me that the UN was lying and that it knew very much that it had something to hide. And that evidence, both that the UN knew it was responsible and that it had something to hide, kept building. It kept building because as soon as people started saying, "Okay, the UN, you're denying it, let's do all these other tests," it was independent groups, the Haitian government. At every step, the UN would first refuse to allow anybody to conduct these independent tests or share its own data. But then the UN started to even deny that finding the source was important, and this was gaslighting of the highest order. It's quite obvious that knowing the source of an epidemic is essential to responding to it and to preventing other epidemics. In fact, the whole discipline of global health and the science of epidemiology is, by many accounts, started with John Snow's identification of the source of the 1854 cholera epidemic in London. So of course you needed to know. And the fact that the UN was saying we didn't need to know just confirmed to everybody, including especially Haitians, that the UN knew that it was responsible and just did not want documentation of that because it did not want the consequences of the fact being established. And so I will, and what the UN did do to deflect it was to use racist tropes to blame Haitians, to say that Haitians were dirty, that there was poor infrastructure. That part was true, that there was poor infrastructure, but again, that was created by the international communities keeping Haiti down for years. And so instead of actually responding with public health principles, the UN doubled down on the racism to avoid paying the consequences of its actions. And I'll let Bia talk about how the UN was forced to face some of those consequences.
So over time, as the evidence became increasingly clear that MINUSTA was in fact responsible for the introduction of cholera to Haiti, and also seeing the way that the UN was resisting even launching a real investigation into its own role and the source of the outbreak, activists increasingly started coming to the BAI to ask if there wasn't something that we could do, kind of using the tools of law to try to hold the UN. And at the time, I was personally tasked with looking into this question of, well, what can actually be done? What legal avenues can be pursued to try to seek accountability from the UN? And I initially was quite skeptical of this as a good place for us to invest our resources. I think we were reluctant to pick this fight. We were worried that especially kind of anti-UN forces in the United States would pick this up and use it as a reason to push for the defunding of the United Nations. But these concerns never really ended up materializing, because it turns out that although sort of the same actors that I think are quite critical of multilateral institutions, at the same time also like the fact that MINUSTA in this case was essentially doing the US's bidding for much less money than if the US had to put their own troops on the ground. I was also skeptical because the law itself just simply didn't seem to allow for a way for us to proceed. And so the main treaty that governs the UN's operations worldwide is called the Convention on Privileges and Immunities. And in section 2, it says the UN shall enjoy immunity from every form of legal process. Not very promising. But there's another part of the treaty, section 29, which also says that the UN shall provide for appropriate modes of settlement of private law claims. So what does this mean? Well, we started looking at a status of forces agreement that is in effect, that's modeled after a model status of forces agreement that is in force all around the world where the UN has peacekeeping operations. And it has a standard clause in that status of forces agreement that says that third-party claims for personal injury, illness, or death that is attributable to MINUSTA shall be settled by a standing claims commission. Sorry, I keep trying to move Brian around here, but I think we're doing okay. And so what this seemed to suggest was that although the UN has immunity from suit in domestic courts, that there is meant to be an avenue for civilians who suffer injuries and death attributable to UN peacekeeping operations to actually be able to have their claim. And just a reminder that it does use the word shall, right? It's not the UN may do this, it's obligatory. And so what we ended up doing was we decided to take the UN for its word. And we found in the back of an obscure General Assembly resolution a standard claims form that seemed to mostly be made for car accidents, but nonetheless had key information that the UN required in order to initiate a claim. This was more or less the only information that we had available to us in trying to figure out how to proceed. There was no publicly available information about where one goes to file a claim against the UN. There was no information about the burden of proof one has to meet or what legal standard the UN would apply in deciding whether a claim was legitimate. And so we were very much operating in the dark. But we decided to take a page from the BAI's book, which generally speaking, the BAI, most of the work that they do is in the Haitian courts. And the Haitian court system is not necessarily set up to deliver justice based on the law, but is very susceptible to corruption and bribery. And a lot of people kind of enter that system by giving in to some of those forces and where they have the financial means might use that to try to get their clients the remedies that they seek or to get their clients out of jail. But the BAI is committed to trying to build up the rule of law in part by utilizing the Haitian court system. And Mario often says, we use this system not because it works, but as if it works. Because only if we keep pushing through the Haitian courts by filing high quality briefs, by representing clients in the way that they deserve to be represented, will we one day see a Haitian justice system that actually can deliver justice regardless of economic needs. And so we took a similar approach to the UN's claim system, and we developed a petition for relief that was very much styled after a US legal complaint. And in it, we tried to predict any counter arguments that the UN might bring against the claim. And so we submitted this pretty hefty document and we sought 3 forms of remedies from the UN. Compensation for the victims, cholera elimination through investment in infrastructure, and a public apology that would acknowledge the fact that, that the UN was denying the truth and that Haitians' dignity was at stake. So we submitted these claims in November of 2011, about a year into the cholera outbreak. At this point, I was still a bit hesitant as to whether this was the right thing for us to do, to be investing our resources in, given the fact that there was no clear kind of avenue for us to proceed. But Mario and colleagues who had a much longer history than I had fighting for social justice, they reminded me that in these moments where the system doesn't seem set up to deliver justice, that's not a reason not to try. And so we ended up submitting our claims directly to the UN in New York, to the Office of Legal Affairs, as well as to MINUSTA in Haiti. And it took the UN about 15 months to respond to the claims. And when they did, they dismissed it in the form of essentially a 2-sentence rejection that said that consideration of the claims would necessarily involve a review of policy or politics, and so therefore it was not receivable under Section 29, which, as you'll recall, Section 29 is the very clause that says that the UN shall provide settlement of private law. So we wrote back to the UN and we sought clarification, and we reminded the UN that specifically for claims that cannot be internally resolved through the US legal system, the UN has an obligation to then separately refer them to a standing claims commission that's meant to provide some some independent adjudication of the claims. And in response to that argument, the UN came back with a rather circular argument saying that there's no legal basis for the UN to establish a commission for claims that have been deemed non-resoluble. And so we learned from this that the UN not only had not established a claims commission in Haiti, but that they would not. But also that the UN had never established a claims commission in the organization's history, despite this being a standard clause in some 32 agreements that were in effect at the time. And the upshot of all of this is that there was no legal forum that one could turn to seek justice from the UN and to seek compensation for the injuries. So we decided against this, before I get to that, let me just quickly say that one of the kind of unexpected outcomes of this loss of our legal claims, or the rejection of our legal claims. Oh, thank you. Let me see if I can. Okay. That's okay, I got it. There's some more colleagues joining, so just want to make sure that they're. Okay, thanks. One of the unexpected outcomes of being rejected through the UN system is that it started to really change the way that the public was perceiving this claim. I think up until that point, the media largely gave the UN the benefit of the doubt. They knew that these claims were pending. And I think there was a general hope that the UN would, faced with these claims, turn around and do the right thing, and that it would spur some positive change. But when we were faced with this rather terse dismissal, the media, in particular mainstream media, really went after the UN and called them out on their double standard. And so although we had lost through the UN's internal claims process, it ended up being quite an important win in the court of public opinion, which opened up a whole new space to be able to pursue the fight for justice. And so against this background, because we had nowhere else to turn, we decided to take the unprecedented action of filing a class action lawsuit against the UN in court in the United States. And the reason we felt we now had an opening to do that is because the UN had taken a position that was so clearly in violation of a material clause of the treaty that granted immunity. And if you look at the historical documents, the travaux préparatoires of the treaty, it's clear that this commitment to providing remedies through alternate means was sort of a reciprocal duty that the UN had to adhere to in order to seek protection from being able to be sued. Now, the UN itself did kind of stuck by their guns in terms of not even showing up in court. So instead, they asked the US State Department to come and defend their case, because that's sort of how they protect their immunities, is by not even showing up in court to argue. And so the US State Department ended up entering the case and taking the position that the case should be dismissed because immunity was unaffected by the UN's alleged breach of the treaty. And one of the problems that this added for us was that US courts are generally obligated to defer to the US State Department on matters related to foreign policy. And so what was already a hard battle became even more of an uphill battle with the US entering the case. And ultimately, in the US case, the district court ended up agreeing with the United States and dismissed the case. We ended up appealing it to the Second Court of Appeals, who also reinforced the district court's decision. And so at this point, we had really lost at every turn, right? We had lost through the UN claims proceedings twice. and we had lost in front of the US courts twice. But I think one of the things that we found to be quite important coming out of the lawsuit was that it still really helped shift the public narrative. And so here's an excerpt from the New York Times editorial board in 2013 that was published a couple of days after we filed the lawsuit. And if you recall the op-ed that we showed earlier, really placing the blame on the victims, you can really see this quite enormous shift in narrative around the importance of accountability and what it means for the UN to be unwilling to hold itself responsible. And so with that, I'll turn it back over to Brian to talk about the public advocacy that accompanied the litigation.
One of our challenges on both in terms of public advocacy, but I think it also was a challenge for the legal advocacy, is that we got no support from the Haitian government. Remember that the Haitian government had been basically chosen by the United States at first. There had been elections in two elections before the cholera outbreak, but the governments were really dependent on MINUSTA for their daily security, for many government operations, and the ones that weren't done by MINUSTA were largely financed by the international community. So none of the governments felt, and we talked to people inside the governments, and everybody knew that the UN was responsible, but none of them felt that they could say that without risking getting put on a plane like President Aristide did. And so we needed to fight a pretty big uphill battle. And kind of the way we did it, it's somewhat following a Haitian proverb, which is "Men en pile chai palu," many hands makes the load light. And this ended up being what we felt was probably our most important work, although we saw ourselves as lawyers. What probably made the biggest difference was our helping to nurture this very broad advocacy network. And Bea, can we go back to the spaghetti chart slide? And this is really what we consider to be our most impactful work. And it's our effort. I mean, it's a mess, but I think it accurately reflects the complexity of this kind of advocacy. The way that, just to explain it, the UN obviously is at the middle, and all of those, the red arrows are lines of pressure, and all the blue dotted arrows are lines of collaboration. And basically what we did was help to nurture this network of a broad range of people. And it was not any formal network. Many people who were part of it would deny that they were part of it. For example, there was an expert in sanitation who we were on panels with, and every time we pulled out this slide, she said, "I'm not part of you guys." She'd say good natured, but she'd say, "Look, I'm a scientist, I'm doing science, not advocacy." But we would take her science and get it to journalists, and that would turn into advocacy. And so we worked with media, we worked with government officials, we worked with filmmakers, storytellers, journalists, NGOs of all kinds, to try to put this very diffuse network to concentrate its advocacy efforts on the United Nations. And we also had somewhat of we had inside strategies as well. We reached out to independent experts within the UN system and special rapporteurs. We had, one kind of unexpected inside help. Our colleague Mario was a finalist for the Martin Ennals Human Rights Award, which is a big human rights award given every year in Geneva. And, all of official Geneva was in this huge auditorium to hear everybody's speeches. And Mario's speeches first thanked everybody, all the human rights mechanisms, for supporting the prosecution of Jean-Claude Duvalier, who had recently returned to Haiti, and Mario was leading that prosecution and getting a lot of international help. But then he said, well, the same issues apply to the cholera epidemic, and it's the same type of violation of human rights, and we're not getting any help. Two people after him was Navi Pillai, who was at the time the High Commissioner for Human Rights, and she's kind of going through her speech, and then she pauses and looks at everybody and says, I just want to respond to something that Attorney Joseph said, and he's right. the UN is responsible. I've told that to the Secretary General, and I'm going to tell him again. And then she went back to her speech. We immediately tweeted that out and got it around the world, and it got into the AP, and became the public record. The next day, Mario and I we had a morning meeting on another issue at the High Commission for Human Rights office, and while we were walking in, the press secretary pulled us aside and said, Navi, people are saying that High Commissioner Pillai said that the UN needs to respond justly, and we know she didn't really say that, and so we're going to put out a press release that says she didn't, and we said, well, she actually did say that, and it's already out in the Associated Press that she said that, so it's too late, and so it just shows that how much even the human rights bureaucracy in Geneva was willing to fight against the High Commissioner for telling the truth on this case. We also had an inside strategy in terms of trying to get member states to step up, and that was a challenge. And Bia was doing a lot of this work, but we'd meet with generally governments run by majority Black countries and Asian and Latin American countries. They would tend to be very supportive, but they would say there's little we can do. Even some of the powerful European countries would say we're supportive, but there's little we can do, because nobody wanted to step up to the U.S. on this. Canada eventually did play what we believe, a lot of this was things that we're kind of looking at the shadows on the wall, but when the Trudeau government came in, we reached out through Stephen Lewis, who we'd been collaborating with on this case, and we got some introductions to some high-level people, and were able to explain what was going on, and we're fairly confident, Bia can correct me, we're fairly confident that Canada ended up playing a fairly significant role in pushing the UN to respond a little bit more justly. And I'll let Bia pick up from here.
And so part of this strategy ultimately also, in addition to the story that Brian told about Navi Pillai and their sort of quote, also involved trying to slowly build up support from within the UN system, and to try to use this as a way to legitimize the framing of the cholera epidemic as a human rights violation, and to create space for other actors to join the fight. And I think that's where the UN human rights system ended up being quite useful in pushing the fight for justice forward. So fast forward to 2016, and I sort of sped through the legal process, but where we are now is that the litigation was pending before the Second Circuit Court of Appeals. And we had just gotten Canada to engage at the UN, and there was increasing pressure from member states finally to get the UN to do the right thing. And so in August of 2016, we reached this breakthrough moment. I was just happened to be having dinner with Sebastian Walker, the journalist who was quoted at the very beginning, who was one of the journalists who broke the story of the UN being the source of the outbreak. And he got one of those banners from the New York Times on his phone and couldn't believe that this was the breaking news headline. And it turns out that the way that this had come about was that the UN Special Rapporteur on Extreme Poverty had taken up the cause and had sent a report that was about to be presented to the General Assembly. And when somebody at the Secretariat got wind of this, by this point in time, there's a lot of principled individuals within the UN Secretariat who were deeply upset by the way the UN was handling this. And so somebody within the Secretariat leaked the report to the New York Times, which then spurred the reporter from the Times to reach out to the Secretary General. And finally, 6 years into the outbreak, we see this massive shift in the UN's narrative and some indication that they're willing to accept some role. It took about 3 months from there and a lot of additional advocacy to get the UN to issue a public apology. The apology, I think, has been heavily scrutinized both by lawyers and the media. As you can see, it's not all that satisfying. But I think importantly, we had a live stream going of the apology at the BAI, where victims' representatives and organizers were gathered to view the General Assembly meeting where the Secretary General for the first time had convened the whole General Assembly on this issue. And we provided a live translation of his statement. And I think to the people in the room, they received this as a really critical way forward and emphasized at the same time that words are not enough and that it had to be followed by action. And the action that the Secretary General announced was the new approach to cholera in Haiti that you read about. And in some ways, I think it very much tracked the key demands that we have been fighting for, in that there was a public apology and that there was a promise of $200 million towards material assistance that was meant to target those most affected by cholera. And also there was a promise of cholera treatment, in particular about $200 million that was meant to go towards treatment that eventually contributed to a huge reduction in the amount of cases that we saw. And so at the end of the day, of course, as you'll have seen from your readings, there were some deep problems with what the UN proposed. And one of the key challenges is that the ultimate approach, I think, was still grounded in treating Haitians as beneficiaries of charity. Even after this public apology, Haitians were never treated as rights holders. They were never allowed to participate in the development of the contents of the new approach. And one of the big things that we focused our work on was that this material assistance should include direct compensation for the victims. That was something that the communities themselves found really important. And in one of the more upsetting episodes towards the end of this advocacy was that victims were very much organizing around Haiti on these questions. We had translated the new approach into Haitian Creole so that there could be more access to it. And in their materials, talking about what the UN was doing to build a few community projects, they referred to the BAI's activities trying to empower victims as a risk to the success of their community projects. And so all the way through to the end, we never quite saw that fundamental shift that we were hoping for in how Haitians themselves were involved in the process. I think the other shortcoming was that the UN never actually admitted legal responsibility and continued to treat this as a matter of their moral responsibility. Oops, we lost Brian. And because of that, the UN ended up seeking voluntary financing for the new approach. Whereas if the UN has responsibilities that are legal responsibilities, it actually has a legal obligation to finance those responsibilities through assessed contributions, which is where member states contribute to the UN's budget, and it had to make it a part of its budget. And in turn, where we ended up was that to date, the UN still has only raised about 5% of the total that they committed to. So I want to just turn it over to Brian to say a few words on kind of where this leaves us, and then we'll turn it over to questions.
So we're at a situation where, not sure if it's half full or half empty, but the glass is neither full nor empty. As Bia mentioned, we did not get what the victims were legally entitled to, but I think we did get quite a bit that was, especially in retrospect, and especially when you look at other efforts to hold the UN accountable, was pretty significant. One very concrete progress was the creation of a cholera vaccine stockpile, which had not existed before. We were not involved directly in the cholera vaccine stockpile, but at one point when I was pessimistic about the results from all our hard work, I was talking to someone who was involved with it, and they said, "No, you did this. You did the cholera vaccine," because the UN was the main force in creating it, and it was very clear from their discussions that their motivation was they didn't want us to be able to complain, and they didn't want any. They wanted to silence the critiques for their response to the cholera violation. So it ended up having this very important collateral consequence that has saved lives on a large scale during subsequent cholera outbreaks. There was also in the very next peacekeeping mission that was authorized. It was for Mali after the apology. It had an explicit mandate, an environmental mandate, as written into the peacekeeping mission's basic documents. And most peacekeeping missions since then have had some kind of an environmental or sanitation mandate. There's been comprehensive improvements in how peacekeepers are tested and deployed and treated once they are there. So you can't prove how many people haven't gotten sick because of this work, but we are fairly confident that it has. And our work for broader accountability that came up when there was debates about another peacekeeping mission in Haiti, which it's was authorized 2.5 years ago by the Security Council, but it's not a UN mission. It's a Kenyan police mission with several other Caribbean and Central American countries providing some support. But the resolution for that mission required a robust mechanism for accountability. That mechanism wasn't put in for a long time until literally last month. But again, it's probably the best mechanism that has ever been in a UN peacekeeping mission. And so we are gradually seeing some of these improvements in international in the UN responding to the risk of these kinds of events. But where I think that the impact is greatest is that once again Haiti has shown the path towards liberation and global justice. Haiti showed that you can overcome the UN's denial, because the UN, we didn't talk much about this, but there have been other incidents where the UN has had large scale malfeasance that caused great harm, and it always gets by just denying it, saying it didn't happen, and eventually the scandal dies down. But Haitians showed that by being persistent and by developing an advocacy network with lots of collaborators, you can successfully critique the UN until it has to respond justly. And that, to me, is probably the biggest example, because that's a prime motivator of the UN to avoid these kinds of problems. And if the UN does do something else like this, then I think that there's a good chance that the next set of advocates can pick up where Haiti left off.
Okay. Wonderful. So I would say it's an inspiring story of resilience that makes me think of a poem that a colleague of mine always tells me, and in these kind of advocacy causes where you don't see any resolution, which is a line from the T.S. poem. For us, there is only the trying. The rest is not our business. But obviously it is our business, because you can see that, by focusing on the trying and actually not giving up, you can have a concrete result. So thank you so very much for this presentation. I'll invite some students to ask questions, but I realize a lot of the questions have been answered. So if you say it has been answered, just I'll skip to the next person. So I'll start with, I think Iris' question has been answered largely. I'll start with Emily.
Maybe you were getting into it at the end, but what measures do you think could be implemented to ensure that in the future the UN or other relevant authorities promptly acknowledge and take responsibility for their wrongdoing?
Yeah, it's a great question, and I'm curious Brian's thoughts as well on this point. I mean, I think sort of from a legal perspective, one of the key shortcomings that I think this case ended up spotlighting is the absence of any mechanism to independently adjudicate claims against the UN, and from that arose this really huge accountability gap. In some ways, I think what exists on paper could potentially be employed, at least as a starting point, as a mechanism. So the Standing Claims Commission is supposed to be this 3-member panel, but I think that if something like that is ultimately implemented, some of the things that we would need to see as a part of that is a much larger effort to ensure that the populations in peacekeeping host countries are aware that there are such mechanisms and that they're actually made accessible to the people. B, I think we need a lot more transparency in the actual standards and procedures that govern such panels. And C, I think one of the key takeaways from this has been that in the absence of sort of a way to enforce ultimate admissions of responsibility, even when they're kind of quasi-admissions, that you really can't rely on voluntary funding as a way to finance reparations. And so finding some way to actually have an independent assessment of legal responsibility, and when that responsibility is determined, empowering those bodies to issue enforceable decisions that then can directly be financed through budgetary means, I think is quite critical.
Kristen?
Yeah, so in one of the papers that we read prepare, it talks a lot about like the role of like Western media and how like it covered like the Haitian government and like through kind of a one-sided lens. And so I was just wondering, when the outbreak first occurred in 2010, did the Western media have any role in shaping the narrative around it, or did they have any role as well as like playing towards the UN's apology eventually?
Brian, do you want to take that, or do you want me to?
Sure, I'll give it a shot. Yes, is a quick answer. The Western media, had a vital role because that was really one of the prime ways of influencing the UN. And for the most cases, Bia mentioned, most media was highly deferential to the UN. I think most people that that cover the UN, they tend to be kind of liberal internationalists and like to think the UN is doing good things and will give it the benefit of the doubt. One exception was the AP stringer in Haiti, who I think he probably fits that description, but he was on the ground, and he actually right after the outbreak went up to the camp and talked to people as Mario and Bia did, and and saw what was happening, and so he very quickly was explaining exactly what happened. Another example was Al Jazeera, and that was kind of interesting. This was towards the early years of Al Jazeera, and it was interesting that you had a bit of a conflict where Al Jazeera was telling a lot more of the truth than a lot of the Western media, and I think eventually pushed the Western media to do a better job. And one kind of example of how this sort of deference to the UN, and you get the same deference to the State Department and other kind of institutions. One example of how this worked was that we had, by time and time again, we just keep going back to media, and they didn't believe us at first, but eventually when we kept showing after months and years that they were lying, people eventually got it. But after the first court hearing in New York District Court, there was a whole new set of journalists there who weren't aware of this, and all the initial stories reflected the UN and the US's approach. And we were sitting there in this conference room of this law firm that was helping us out, looking at this media that started coming out, within hours of the end of the hearing, and we were outraged because they were making the exact same mistakes that their international affairs colleagues had made at this point 5 years earlier, and just taking the UN at its word, which at that point was clearly not justified. And so we had to go through this whole process of reaching out to them and saying, you can't say that, that's total crap. And it just shows that there is a bias within the media towards these these kind of mainstream forces that you obviously need to have a strategy to overcome.
If I can just add very quickly too, it's important to think about the media and these longer racist and anti-Black representational economies in relation to Haiti. So Haitian scholars, I'm thinking in particular of Gina Ulysses, who wrote this wonderful book, Why Haiti Needs New Narratives, or more recently, Miriam Chansey, whose book, Harvesting Haiti, sort of addresses these longer representational economies in which Haitians are seen as these vectors of disease, of filth, of failed states. Like this is a language that's tended to dominate the ways in which Haiti gets represented in the Western media. And in fact, during the AIDS epidemic, Paul Farmer actually wrote a book on the geography of blame, looking at the ways in which Haitians were also pathologized, these 5 vectors of transmission that were seen as hemophiliacs, hos, Haitians were one of them, right? So it's the way in which the media also had these longer racist histories that were very easy to go to in trying to think about, okay, it happened in Haiti, it must be the Haitians, it must be their own individual responsibility for this cholera epidemic, because we all know that this is a failed state, these are dirty people, there's nowhere else to go to look for an explanation. So they bought into that very, very easily.
Maybe simply the failure of attention
Absolutely.
in the media,
Yes,
you know,
yeah.
for some.
It's not important, these folks can disregard it.
So you tell me, Manveed, has your question been answered or? Okay,
Yeah, I feel like.
so I'll go to Daniel.
I have a different question actually than what I wrote. I'm just curious about the legal mechanics. So when you go to sue the United Nations, are they a legal person? Like, are they incorporated in some jurisdiction somewhere? And then if you were to somehow win a lawsuit against them, like, who is your plaintiff? How are you gonna win damages and then distribute those damages? Like, where would that money be coming from? I'm just curious about that.
Sure. Yeah, so where to start? So we had 5 named plaintiffs in the lawsuit. It was a combination of Haitians living in Haiti and Haitian Americans, because we wanted to also make sure, even though it wasn't technically required, to have some hook back to the United States. We sued the UN in New York court because that is where the UN is headquartered. And so the big questions that arose around the fact that the UN has immunity and the extent of that immunity, which includes making it very difficult to serve process. And until you can serve process, you don't have jurisdiction over the UN. And so that in itself ended up becoming quite a drawn out process. When we initially filed our claims before the US lawsuit, even that part of the process was a huge hurdle. And quite dramatic. So we had called the Office of the Secretary General and asked where we could deliver documents. We don't want to say exactly what they were because we figured that they might then try to avoid making themselves accessible to us. And we were initially told that somebody from the Secretary General's office could come down and receive them and take them up, because you can only enter the UN's premises if you have UN accreditation, which as a small NGO, we do not. And so we, one of our legal interns actually went to the UN to try to deliver these documents. And we also sent a separate copy via courier because we thought maybe like a formal mail deliverer would have a better luck. And I was on the phone with our intern as he got to the gates and said like, okay, I'm here, call the Secretariat now. And so I called them. But at that point, they sort of started getting wind that something was off. And so they said, actually, we can't come down. You can just leave it with security. But of course, security said, well, you can't leave a package here. And so there was no way for us to physically actually access the UN to deliver the claims, even though the system said you're supposed to be able to file claims. The way that it ended up happening was ultimately Mario was able to access MINUSTA in Haiti and deliver the claims there. For the US lawsuit, I'm actually blanking, right, on how we ultimately got the documents served.
They served the Secretary General. Remember when he was out at a speech?
Who did you name, Pia? You said they were.
So so the 5 were the plaintiffs, and then on the defense side, we named the UN as an organization, MINUSTA as an organization, the Secretary General, and Edmond Moulet, who was the head of MINUSTA in Haiti, and actually by that point had been promoted to be the head of UN peacekeeping generally, and was in New York. But to your broader question of sort of how does this all work? I mean, part of the answer is that we don't really know because it hadn't fully been tried in the past. And the question of immunity is such a preliminary question that once we started process, the immediate question thereafter was, well, does the UN have immunity from suits such that there's not subject matter jurisdiction over these claims? And we knew that that was sort of going to be where the fight would play out. And it's worth noting that I think sometimes when you litigate, it's important to also keep in mind the ways that the litigation itself can become a distraction from the broader fight. But here, I think in some ways, it provided a way for us to tell the story of this immense denial of access to justice that it, in many ways, was the heart of the issue here. And so with the UN's assertion of immunity, our anticipation was that if we could overcome immunity, that likely at that point, the UN would try to make an effort to settle the case. Because the evidence, even based on the evidence that was publicly available, was so strong against the UN and was so clear in establishing liability
And
that.
their own experts too.
Exactly, and so it seemed unlikely that the UN would want this fight in court. And we tried to make it quite clear, I think, in our communications, both directly with the UN and in our public statements, that our end goal here was not to get to the end of litigation for litigation's sake. Like, we weren't there to prove a point, we were there to try to secure remedies for the affected communities, and that there are many ways that we could get there outside of the courts, but up until that point, the UN had been unable to come to the table. And so the hope was that there would be some way to resolve this amicably, that would not involve needing to obtain a judgment and seek enforcement of that judgment.
So if there is anybody else, please put up your hand. So I have Ali, and then I will go to you. Okay, Ali?
I think my questions were answered a good amount.
Okay.
Yeah.
You're fine, okay.
Yeah, hello. I'm not a law student. I'm in the Department of History. And so one of the questions that I had was actually about the UN's new approach, that document that you showed like excerpts about. And like the sections on the material assistance and the part on most affected by cholera. What does material assistance actually mean? Are there limits to it? Is it like within the area of health? Or could it just be money that's kind of pushed into kind of the military aspects of the UN's occupation of Haiti? And also, like, how is the most affected kind of section being defined?
Yeah, it's a great question, and I think my read on that is that this was the UN's effort to avoid having to say compensation for the victims. And they never used the word compensation in any of their documents, and there was quite an intense internal fight over us also making the case that we don't really care about what words you use to describe what it is that you're doing, but the thing that matters is whether people have access to some form of remedy that actually is recognizing that breadwinners died, children died, that this is not just a matter of like putting in a new water pump in a neighborhood. These are real losses that under the UN's own framework merit compensation. And similarly, the most affected also was not defined, but it gave just enough room for us to be able to say, you also have to recognize the different ways, the sort of different levels of victimization that the deaths that have occurred as a result of this merit a specific kind of recognition that maybe is different from a community that generally has been devastated by disease, but for where individuals haven't suffered that individualized loss. And so initially, I think there was some hope that that language, while broad, still gave us the wiggle room to be able to advocate for not just specific outcomes, but also specific processes around involving affected communities and ensuring that they also had a say in ultimately what this material assistance was going to look like. And that ended up being, I think, our kind of key fight with the UN was over the role of consultation and kind of what participation Haitians were going to be allowed in the process now that they had announced that they were going to put in place this new approach. And that consultation process never actually took off, despite the fact that there's very explicit commitments to doing so.
Maybe one question which is a more detailed, Stanley.
Thank you. Well, this question might be slightly beyond the scope, but I'm just very curious because the joint submission focused on two specified groups of victims. So on the one hand, there's families of the individuals who died of cholera in Haiti. On the other hand, there were the survivors of cholera in Haiti. Section 5 of the joint submission also states that cholera epidemic has produced widespread, complex, and diffuse harms for individuals throughout Haiti, and that under international human rights law, such victims are also entitled to effective remedy. So I take it that because of the word also, the word victims in this sentence refers to people beyond those two specified groups. So I was wondering if you could offer some examples of, or just any further clarification on what would constitute effective remedies under international human rights law for those victims.
Yeah.
Would the UN's responsibility vis-a-vis them be like legal responsibility be attenuated in some sense? Is the obligation better conceived as something owed by the international community at large?
Sure, and Brian, please jump in here as well, but I think what you've identified was our perhaps unsuccessful attempt at threading the needle a little bit, in the sense that I think, so this submission was made to UN special procedures, mandate holders, special rapporteurs, independent experts who work within the UN system to report on human rights violations. And so we were largely framing the issue in the context of international human rights law. And I think you're absolutely right that there is quite a broad way that one can legitimately think about what is a redressable harm under human rights law that includes the massive violations of the right to access clean water, the right to access health, and so on, that kind of goes beyond, maybe health is not a great example, but that goes beyond the people who themselves contracted cholera and either lost a family member or survived the disease, but have kind of lasting impacts as a result of it. And so human rights law generally, I would say, takes a broader view of victimhood and of also how you think about what violations can give rise to a legitimate claim for effective remedies. On the other hand, within the UN's own framework, the obligation to compensate is very much limited to kind of direct injury in terms of personal injury, in terms of illness, in terms of death. And I think part of what has always been challenging with this issue, and often is challenging with these kinds of issues, is that on the one hand, we want to hold the broader injustice, right? The structural injustice that has led to this in the first place. We want to be able to tell that story and not lose the fact that also this caused widespread trauma across Haiti. This was not just something that was limited to kind of individual families, but it was an experience that the country suffered as a result of MINUSTA's reckless waste management. And yet also, oftentimes, if that's your entry point, people stop listening. And it becomes sometimes harder to kind of to make the case. And I think part of what we were trying to do was to be as exact as we could in squeezing this within the US legal framework, because we thought that that was the most effective hook that we had for kind of being able to continue to push the claims while also telling this broader story of the impacts.
And just to add to that, we asked for two types of remedies. One were individual remedies, so compensation for people's funeral costs or healthcare costs or lost wages. But we also asked for, a very broad remedy of putting in the water and sanitation system that you need to prevent cholera from returning in Haiti. And that kind of remedy, that would obviously help a lot of people, many of whom didn't get sick at all or only a little bit from cholera. That's the type of remedy we would, we never felt we had much chance of getting that from a US court, even if we did get to trial. But it is one that, is certainly worth asking. And I think there is justification under international law for asking. And it is something that the UN did promise to try to do, although it didn't actually do it.
Thank you.
I have a question in the back, and then I have a question by Joel Kaufman online. We'll try to connect you, Joel, but first a question in the back, yes.
Yeah, I think my question was actually regarding that delivery of the compensation. So to what extent was those promises made by the UN in terms of compensation actually delivered, and what were the mechanism? Like, who was in charge of the delivery? Was it the Haitian communities themselves abroad? And I wanted to have more clarification on those new measures you've mentioned that have been sort of integrated in this new UN-led missions to Haiti. And sort of last one, in terms of what do you think this sort of fight that you've had on like a health issue can sort of teach for other sort of UN actions in Haiti, such as sexual violence by the minister, or like maybe there's new missions coming in, and what have we learned from this fight that can be applied in Australia?
Yeah, that's great. Maybe quickly to say a few words on the implementation of remedies. So the UN ended up pretty much silently dropping compensation altogether. And part of it was that, they sort of raised this concern around feasibility of what it would look like to actually compensate, the tens of thousands of people who had lost loved ones, and the over 1 million people who had been sickened, especially in a context where there wasn't strong documentation of, like, there weren't laboratory tests that were done every time somebody contracted cholera. But these were all challenges that were answerable. And part of the problem with the UN's approach is that they said they were going to assess the feasibility of an individual compensation approach and then never did. And so we ended up putting quite a lot of resources into conducting essentially a shadow feasibility assessment that drew really heavily from other comparative contexts where reparations have been delivered in resource constrained settings, and offer that to the UN, but it kind of felt was not picked up essentially. And so what the UN did do is, instead of following through on an individual approach, was that they prioritized instead putting in these $150,000 community projects that they essentially went to communities and said, well, what are your local development needs? And then based on that, gave a list of, like, here are 3 projects we could consider. And then the communities were allowed to choose from those. And so there was, like, the repavement of, I don't know, 500 yards of road. There was a pump that was put in place. There was a renovation of the marketplace in the area where cholera had first broken out. And so some of the questions around how compensation ultimately would be delivered, you know, we're not fully resolved, but we got a long way there, and then that was never really taken up. Just on the point about sexual abuse. Oh, and I actually see Sandra in the waiting room. I was just gonna give her a shout out. See if we can get her back. So Sandra was, as you may know, directs the International Human Rights Clinic here, although she's on leave at the moment. But Sandra has worked quite heavily on the question of sexual exploitation and abuse, so she would be a great person to talk to this about. Yeah, I think some of the lessons, one is that I do think we've seen sort of a shift in how the UN at least pays lip service to the obligations that are owed, but also who the people are who are the survivors of sexual exploitation and abuse. And so you see this language around the need for rights-based approaches, for centering the victims, and the problem has been how that's implemented in practice. And so I guess one lesson that I'm hoping that you all take away from this here is, you know, I think we're finding ourselves, especially from where I sit in the United States, in a moment of a real crisis for institutions, where institutions are actively being dismantled by the Trump administration. But I think part of what enables that is a period of sort of a crisis of confidence for institutions more broadly, that extended not just, you know, doesn't just come from Elon Musk and Trump, but from the individuals who are meant to be served by these institutions. And I think that there's an important question for us all about how we fight for our institutions to be able to do the important work that they're there to do, but also ensure that they do that in a way that's accountable to the rights holders, to the communities they're meant to serve. And one of the takeaways that I hope you're taking from this is that as we embark on those kind of advocacy journeys, that we need to be laser focused on strategy while also holding on to basic principle. And I think sometimes there can be kind of this gut reaction to, like, take them all down because they're not doing the work in the right way. But I think if we can find ways to actually hold institutions to the principles that we believe in by engaging really kind of well thought out strategy, that hopefully we can ultimately push them into a place where they have more legitimacy among the constituents who at the end of the day are going to have to be the ones that rise up and save them.
I know there's a comment online. I just wonder if Brian and Bea, this has been incredible. And I have so much things to come back to you now for the last part of the report that we haven't finished yet, but this is great. Can you maybe share with everyone, like, where is Haiti now with cholera? And since all of these executive orders, are there things that have actually stopped that you're aware of in Haiti, like projects that have just been cancelled? But where are they now with cholera? I just wondered if maybe you could.
Very brief,
Yeah.
because there are other people who want to
Yeah.
use the classroom, but yes.
Brian, can we leave you
5
the
words.
last word to you?
Yeah, sure. Cholera has rebounded, unfortunately, as Haiti's government and public services have been dismantled over the past dozen years. And I believe it's now about 2 years since the cholera epidemic has re-engaged in Haiti. I think it's about 1,000 people have been killed. It's not as bad as it was before. That was somewhere between 10 and 30,000 people, in part because I think a lot of people have immunity, but it is causing a lot of pain in Haiti, as we predicted when the UN refused to adequately respond. We're actually not putting a lot of energy advocating just because we don't think that we can get much traction with everything else going on, and we're putting our scarce resources into other issues for trying to get Haiti back to the democratic path.